is because people started using them for fun. That's why MDMA was banned, that's why LSD was banned. And only now, decades later, are they starting to do studies again on the possible psychotherapeutic benefits of LSD and MDMA. The Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies is a group that was founded 20-something years ago by Rick Doblin. And I thought at the time he was insane because his goal was he was going to get these drugs approved through the system. He's going to work within the system to get them approved in the usual way that you get any drug approved by the FDA, which means you have to get approval for pilot studies, and you move on to phase 1 and phase 2 and all these different studies. You've got to satisfy all the criteria. You've got to be reviewed up the wazoo. But he's actually starting to do it. And so they're doing studies with MDMA, doing studies with LSD, and this may actually happen. Where, I mean, it's kind of sad that it takes decades to get back to where you were to begin with, which is that therapists were allowed to use this. But post-traumatic stress disorder, especially, has been one of the indications they've studied. I don't know exactly what they call it, but basically death-related anxiety. Helping dying patients adjust to their circumstances has been used for both MDMA and LSD. So I mean, there's no question in my mind that it can be useful for those purposes, and there's a chance that may actually get approved in my lifetime to be used again.
The studies are very small, though, and you have to first give them your first warrant in order to get approval.
It's very difficult, and it's Obama promised that he was going to, his policy was going to be science-driven, and science would not be corrupted by politics anymore. And this is like the best refutation. I mean, I'm sure people have other examples, but the best refutation of that promise or policy or attitude or whatever involves drug policy. On marijuana, he insists that it has to be Schedule 1, even though it clearly does not belong in Schedule 1. With these other drugs, he's not willing to make it easier to get the research approved. So he's actively interfering with the research that could validate these uses at the same time that he claims that he stands for uncorrupted science. Anybody else?
Yeah, I appreciate what you said, Mr. Sullum. And I too am interested in finding more liberty and responsibility in the field of drugs. I guess my question is with regards to strategy of how to weaken the federal war on drugs. It seems like it's a pretty coercive and wasteful program, and there's others that are, some would say, are coercive and wasteful too, like the welfare apparatus we have today. I guess my worry is order. If we pursue weakening the war on drugs, are we creating another pretext for strengthening the apparatus of welfare? Insofar as some addicts will be created, or insofar as some believe there will be more addicts if we liberalize the law with drugs, must we start by trimming back the welfare apparatus, or can we barrel ahead trying to weaken the war on drugs, or are we just giving another pretext for more of the welfare state?
Well, I mean, there always will be pretexts. People will always do risky things that don't necessarily involve breaking the law currently. And you can always argue that those people may end up being on welfare, or more likely, you're going to argue that their health care, when they get sick or injured as a result of their risky behavior, will be covered by the government, meaning taxpayers, right? People can always use that argument. I don't think if we waited to impose restrictions on individual freedom until we got rid of that whole welfare apparatus, we would never get rid of restrictions. It is a sort of it's a tough nut to crack because these programs are not going away. In particular, government's involvement in healthcare is only getting more ambitious and more omnipresent. So the best I can come up with when you're dealing with somebody who is not prepared to get rid of those subsidies is to say, is to point out basically the totalitarian implications of using that as an argument for limiting people's freedom. To say it's okay if you want to support taxpayer-funded healthcare, I disagree with you, but please don't use that as an excuse to interfere in everybody's personal behavior, because that's a totally open-ended license for limiting liberty. And there's got to be, most people you talk to, there's got to be something they do that's not so good for them, and it's sort of risky, and that they're worried about seeing that restricted. So I would hope that that argument would work, that maybe you don't care about this particular example of risky behavior, but what about these things you do? Can't we all have this sort of truce where we say, I'm not going to butt into your business if you don't butt into mine? That's sort of, I think, the best you can come up with, given the current system of subsidy. I'm sorry, I just want to take somebody new, if there's anybody new. Not anybody new yet?
Well, to add on to that point, if I recall correctly, we have about the same percentage of people who use heroin, etc., I'm not counting marijuana, as we did before drugs were made illegal a century ago. I mean, hasn't that percentage stayed about the same, like the same amount of so-called alcoholics and that kind of thing?
And there's actually evidence that rates of addiction are greater under prohibition than under legalization, for the absence of prohibition, for want of a better word. It's disputed, right? There's a lot of arguments about exactly how many cocaine addicts were there at the turn of the 20th century, and that they're not very good. There's not very good evidence on that. But I think what is clear is that you do not see the kind of prima facie evidence you would expect to see in terms of drug use if prohibition were effective. In other words, having prohibition or not having prohibition, enforcing prohibition more or more or less, which you have a lot more data on that. There's no consistent relationship. Drug use goes up, drug use goes down, enforcement goes up, enforcement goes down. They don't seem to be related in any way. That you can see that. You don't have to be like a sophisticated statistician to see that. You can just look at the graphs and you can see you're not getting the kind of payoff that we were promised in terms of reducing drug use. And in terms of reducing drug-related harm, which really should be the object, if anything is the object, right? I mean, I'm not so concerned about reducing drug use. And the government, if it's taking a sort of utilitarian approach, shouldn't be concerned about reducing drug use per se. It should be concerned about reducing drug-related harm. And prohibition clearly exacerbates that in a whole variety of ways by making drugs more dangerous, making them more expensive, making the markets violent, and all that stuff. So not to mention the risk of arrest in prison, which is it's a pretty significant danger in itself. Prohibition clearly makes drug use more dangerous for the people who nevertheless choose to use those substances. And the only argument, utilitarian argument in its favor would be that it is preventing a whole bunch of people from using drugs who otherwise would use, not only would use them, but they would become addicted, it would ruin their lives, or it would really cause serious destruction. And that, that's speculative and it's unproven, and I doubt it. You've never run the experiment in exactly that way. There are various reasons to doubt it, and one of the things you can do is look at rates of drug use and drug addiction prior to prohibition, and they're not alarmingly high, and they probably were lower than they are now. Now, of course, there are many things that happen in the interim that might affect rates of drug use, but it seems to be quite clear that prohibition is not having the kind of obvious effect you would expect if we really were preventing addiction. Anybody else?
I'm a cannabis activist, I guess you could say. And when I talk to people trying to figure out what their problem with marijuana is, what's your opposition? Sometimes it seems like, and I'm curious what you think, that we just have this unspoken social bias against getting high. I mean, just catching a buzz. That people don't want to say that's what they're, when they're okay with the pill, but not with the smoking, and you try to drill down. And they don't want to say it, but it just feels a lot like just, a fear that is, by definition, negative to catch bumps.
Right. And this is, I get into this in the book at some length because I think there is this sort of suspicion of pleasure, and that's a big part of our culture going back to the Puritans. Now, it's not complete rejection of pleasure. The Puritans actually had a lot more fun than they're given credit for, and they were drinkers, they were not teetotalers, and they did have games of the kind, probably not very fun games. And they were always anxious. They're always worried about that pleasure would get out of control, and they're always suspicious, especially of sort of unearned pleasure, right? And so to take a drug that right away, without any effort to speak of, makes you happier and more relaxed, from that point of view, there's something very suspect about it. Now, obviously, alcohol does that. And this is the sort of thing it's always puzzled me, is that can't people see that that's what alcohol does? There's no moral distinction between having a drink that helps you relax. I mean, this is what Normal has been saying since the early 70s. Like, there's no moral distinction between coming home at the end of the day and smoking a little pot to relax or having a cocktail or two. None. There's no plausible moral distinction. You see people coming with all kinds of crazy so-called principles that distinguish between alcohol on the one hand and illegal drugs on the other. Things like, well, I like the taste of alcohol. I don't really drink it for the drug wearers say, I like the taste of bourbon or whatever. It's like, well, that might be true. I'm not saying you don't like the taste of bourbon, but first of all, that's not the only thing you like about bourbon. If they had a de-alcohol bourbon, you probably wouldn't like it as much. And people like the taste of marijuana. The people who like to, like marijuana-infused foods, not just for the high, but because of the. Now I know you're making a face. I have the same sort of attitude, but I'm told. Usually when people incorporate cannabis into sweets, like.
I spent a week in Denver and didn't taste even the high. This is supposed to be the best treat you can have.
Yeah, you didn't like the taste.
It wasn't that
Okay, but you know that there is a market, right? Because there are companies that expect.
Yeah.
Most companies are like, we get rid of all that disgusting cannabisness. We just give you the high plus this wonderful treat. But there are companies that specialize in stuff that actually tastes like marijuana. Different strains of marijuana have notably different smells, like wines and beer, and so people can get into that sensual aspect of the experience too, as they do with alcoholic beverages. I think probably in savory foods it would work better as a flavoring agent, than in sweets. I'm not a big fan, but what I'm saying is there are people who do enjoy the smell and the taste, so that's not, that doesn't really distinguish the two. So I think it is a failure. I think people fail to recognize. The vast majority of people are using something to alter their consciousness in a non-medical way, and they don't recognize it as such. So I think that's sort of the problem. There may be people who are taking it, and they call it medical because it makes them feel better. And there's some interesting data on Utah, where Mormons ostensibly do not use psychoactive substances at all, but there's a whole dispute about caffeine. It was not in coffee or tea. You can have Coca-Cola, state chocolate. That's got stimulants in it. They're huge consumers of sugar, Jell-O, which also can have a psychoactive effect. And I believe they're still the #1 per capita consumers of antidepressants. So, yes, but it's medicine, so it's okay, right? So I think we fool ourselves in a variety of ways about what we're doing when we take drugs to affect our consciousness. And people, so there is really a discomfort with that idea. I don't, what my argument is, look, obviously, is that there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. It's only bad if it has bad effects. You have to say, how is this, being incorporated into your life? What kind of relationship do you have with the substance? The same way that you would with alcohol, right? Ask those kinds of questions. And that's, that's what I'm trying to do with the book, is to get people to think about illegal drugs in moral terms that are similar to the way that they think about alcohol.